to one of our first training of the year as part of the Green Commodity community. And again, Happy New Year, everyone. We're still allowed to say Happy New Year. For those of you who are new to the community, it's a collaborative space where practitioners working on sustainable commodities, regardless of their institutions, country, or commodity, or funding, can basically dialogue, exchange with peer practitioners. This is a place where we share good practices on specifically system change and collaborative action, and also where you can access a range of expertise and curated tools, and then apply those skills and tools to effectively collaborate with the stakeholders you're working with across production, demand, and financing. So today's training is linked to one of a new signature methodology on, we call it effective collaborative action, which is basically our approach to system transformation that we just launched last December. And we're going to share the link to the guide to effective collaborative action at the end of the training for those of you who don't know that methodology. And basically, without going into any details here, the guide introduces 4 essential practices to work with for system transformation. One is around building system leadership capacity. One is around working with power. One is working through conflict, and then effective communication. And during 2022, we are going to provide to the community, to member practitioners, a range of core training on this methodology, but also deep dive into each of these essential practices. So today we're focusing on working with power, and more specifically on the question, how can we deal with challenging behavior in real-world collaboration when there is an even distribution of power. And so just for the small personal story, a few years back, many years back, on the first day of my master at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, for those who know the university, on the first day I went there, the head of the Development Studies department started his introductory speech by saying, it's all about power, and power affects everything we do, yet we rarely try to understand it. And this sentence really stayed with me for a long time, for all the years at uni and then after in my work, you know. And as many of you know, working with power is a very hard task because it means many different things, you know. Yeah, you can do power analysis, asking yourself who's not at the table, who needs to be included. It's about listening in a new way, different perspectives, can be building capacity on the issue, developing strategy for inclusive decision-making, etc. So we're going to try to unpack what it means to work with power during the year. And we're starting with today's session that I'm really looking forward to. So welcome again, everyone. And I'm going to turn over to our trainers for today, David and Ellis. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nicolas. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I love seeing the list of the whole planet appearing in the chat, as people who are just joining can also add their names, their organization, and where they're joining us from. It's just nice to see. I am joining you from the Boston area, along with my colleague, Elise Willer, who I'll invite to say a few words in a moment. By way of introduction, Elise, if you could advance the slide, I'd like to just introduce us as an organization in a way. So Insight Collaborative is the umbrella under which we work. We do work in all 3 of these sectors, in academia, in the nonprofit space, and in the private sector. Our work in academia is mostly centered around the Harvard Negotiation Project and the Harvard Mediation Program, which are both at Harvard Law School in Massachusetts in the US. Elise and I are part of a teaching team that teaches through the program on negotiation at Harvard Law School. We teach a class there on mediation and conflict management. And that, of course, leads us to helping people deal with power and power dynamics. Insight Collaborative is an organization that I co-founded many years ago. We also created a for-profit at the same, a few years before that. And Elise has been an integral part of the work at Insight Collaborative for many years. In the nonprofit space, we typically are working with governments, government agencies, nonprofit organizations, NGOs, and just individuals who don't normally get access to the kinds of materials and ideas that we play with in the academic or in the private sector space. We share this diagram in part because it sometimes prompts different questions. If people know that we work both in the private sector and in academia, we also might share stories from those sectors to the extent that it seems relevant to the kinds of questions that you're interested in. I think I'm inclined to sort of leave it there for the moment. Elise, did I forget anything by way of introduction that you'd like to add?
No, I don't think so. If you're up for it, David, I'm just going to jump in and yeah.
Yeah, I think I just want to say a word about power just briefly, just to say there are many sources of power, as you all well know. We're going to focus on a particular type of power source. And here we have other content that also talks about the kinds of power dynamics that play out based on just interpersonal dynamics that have less to do with people's positions and people's authority. Here we're going to talk about where it's about the position of authority and leverage people have, as well as the power that people try to get through the moves they make in their interactions with each other. And that'll come up as we go through the session. Thanks, Elise.
Nice. Thanks, David. If you joined us for the conference last May, you may see some of the same terminology and vocabulary throughout our session today. This will just be a nice, as part of this beginning part, will be just a nice refresher for you. So what David and I want to do is start with just a really brief accelerated version of a course that's taught at the Harvard program on negotiation. The central framework of that course we find very helpful working with power. There are 7 elements, and I want to go through them really quickly here. So the first 2 are communication and relationship. We call these enabling elements. Communication is what you would expect. It's that quality of information exchange. Relationship is trust. Interests are the underlying drivers, the concerns that are behind positions and demands that people make. Options, anything that we can do to meet those interests. Legitimacy is just objective data, information that makes some options seem more fair, more reasonable, more legitimate than others. And if you remember from May, these 3 elements in the center make up the circle of value, because it's in this circle that we can both first create value and then we distribute it. And this framework works a lot like a roadmap. Typically, from top to bottom, we start conversations thinking about our communication, the relationship that we have with others, and then we move through, although sometimes it can work from bottom to top. At the base of this circle, we ask ourselves a question. We have a best understanding of what we can do together with the other party. Is that better than what we can do somewhere else? If yes, we agree and we go to commitment. If no, if this isn't better than what we can do somewhere else, where should we go? That's elsewhere, right? And we call that alternatives. Alternatives provide us one of the main sources of power in any type of influence situation. If you evaluate your alternatives, the things that you can do away from the negotiating table, as being very weak, it means that you are more likely in the negotiation to make concessions. The reverse is also true. So a lot of our advice around dealing with power comes in what can we do to strengthen the alternatives. That's it. That's the framework. I'm gonna pause for a second, just let some of that sink in. Not that big of a deal if you haven't had a chance to absorb all of this. Are there any questions before I move forward on how we work with the circle of value, on the vocabulary? Anything seem confusing? Okay. So we use the circle of value to help clients measure success. We use it to help them prepare in more efficient and structured ways. And we find this to be really helpful when everybody has it in their minds. We also love this model because it works better than anything we've ever seen when they don't have this in the back of their heads. And oftentimes when that's the case, people just use a variety of difficult tactics to get what they want. And we want to spend the rest of our time here today thinking about how do we use this framework to address the difficult tactics that other people are using to get their interests met. Okay. David, I'll let you go over difficult tactics real quick. Sound good?
It does. I'm really glad that we do have the session being recorded. I'm going to have to ask for a copy of it because that was by far the most precise and concise version I've ever seen any of our colleagues deliver on the circle of value. It was really nicely done, Elise. A lot of our colleagues are so in love with this visual diagram that they never want to stop talking about it and go on and on. I'm partially sharing that with you because so many of the people in our field of work rely on this when doing things like coaching. Elise actually worked with the UNDP in Peru as part of her background as a 3-month role that she had there. This was part of the core value add that we have when we're working with people who are dealing with power. This can be used in preparation where we just have specific questions we ask people to think about in each of these 7 categories in advance of a conversation that might be difficult. Or in the process of trying to think through how do we get people to work together where there are complicated power dynamics, we come back to saying, let's actually break it down by these 7 categories. We're going to try to save time at the end for some Q&A if you're curious about that idea of using this for preparation. I am going to follow Elise's suggestion and just move into a very particular use of this. This is also the reason why, one of the reasons why I took this path to become a conflict management consultant was because of what we're about to show you. It's a way of using this diagram. To start, I have to define what Elise and I mean by difficult tactics. There has been some confusion between difficult situations and difficult tactics when we're thinking about this model, so let me be clear. When we're saying difficult tactic, we mean any move that someone can make where they're trying to essentially manipulate us to get what they want. That's sometimes intentional. They're actually thinking, I'm going to make this move and it's going to make it difficult for those people, and then they're going to give me what I want. Sometimes it's just life has taught them that those are the kinds of moves they need to make to get their interests met. So a difficult situation, just as an example, let's say you're trying to get a meeting with a minister who has a lot of influence over the situation, and you call up and you speak to an assistant or a secretary of that minister, and you're trying to actually get time on the calendar. And they say something like, the minister is extremely busy. You're not going to be able to get even more than 15 minutes until next month or 2 months. If that's true, they're actually really that busy. That's just a tough situation. we have advice for how to handle that. Like, how do you still get access to somebody who's telling you that you can't get access for a long time? But that's a tough situation. It's not intentionally designed to make things difficult. However, if the minister has told their assistant to keep putting you off, and it's not true that they don't have time, they're simply doing it as a tactic to try to avoid the conversation, to use delay, for example, in this. If it's just not true, it's a difficult tactic. What do we call that difficult tactic? Someone put it in chat or take yourself off mute. When someone tells us something that's not true, give me a name for that difficult tactic. You can also just take yourself off mute.
Stalling?
Yeah, the way I told the story, I can think of stalling as definitely part of it. That would be the nicest version of it, is they're stalling. Maybe they have good reason to stall. When someone tells us something that's not true, we have another name for that. Yeah, I can see some of you mouthing it. Nana, for example, just mouthed it. Lying. It's bluffing. That is a tactic, right? It's a choice we all have. We can always make the choice to lie. It's a move we can make. Elise and I strongly discourage and don't recommend lying because it's so damaging to the relationship and because it tends to lead to a certain type of thinking that doesn't produce optimal outcomes. And my main point was, it's a difficult tactic. And in fact, Elise, if you could advance the slide, I want to show you a cheat sheet. This is a list that Elise and I have collected over time. If you were with us last May, you know we actually asked the group to help us create a list of the kinds of difficult tactics that you saw. We're not going to do that today. We're just going to ask you to take a look at this list. And please just see if anything's missing. When you think about your own conversations, any situation where you're trying to influence other people, particularly people who either actually or in their minds have power, what is missing from this list? Are there moves you've seen people make, or are there any? Every time we hear a new one, we try to add it to the list. Have you seen any that, in your experience, that didn't make it to this list? Give you a minute to read it. If you can stay where we were, yep, there we go.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. So anything here, Charles? You've taken yourself off mute. Do you something missing?
I'm trying to see if it's on there because it might be in one of these terms already.
Oh, that's okay. Just
when you basically agree, but then do nothing. So you verbally agree, but then you don't follow through.
Yeah, we usually capture that by calling it false commitment. But if it's truly intentional, Charles, I think the reason we may not have created a bullet is I think it's a form of lying. If you on your own list want to add that as a separate one, because then it makes it easier to flag it or spot it, I think that makes sense. Sometimes Americans like to call it moving the goalpost, is another one that I don't see on here, where you actually say, yeah, all I need for a commitment is for you to do this. And then as soon as you give them that, or somebody, one of the stakeholders gives them that, they say, oh, and one more thing. And they keep changing like where the finish line is in this effort to reach agreement. If they're doing that on purpose, it's actually, I think, another form of lying. They're not negotiating in good faith. They know they're going to keep asking for more, even though they know they're telling you or giving you the impression that this is the only thing left. There's a really funny version of that. I heard someone describe that difficult tactic as slicing the salami. So salami as in a piece of meat. You could say slicing the bread, but the idea was they cut off a little slice and they said, just cut off one more little slice of the substance and give it to us, and then we'll be done. And then you cut off the slice and you give it to them and they say, I'm sorry, I spoke to some of my people and we need just one more slice. So you can add that one to the list as well. We think of all of those as essentially forms of lying because they know they're misleading us. But thank you for adding that, Charles. I think that's a helpful nuance. The reason I'm slowing down just on this is because I don't want you to underestimate the value of this slide. It's really helpful to have a list. Why? Because we're less likely to get thrown off balance, especially if we're in a context where we feel like we're in the lower power role in a dynamic. That could mean because you're trying to influence without authority, or it could mean that they actually have direct authority over you in some way. People, when they encounter these kinds of difficult tactics, most of our experience has been that if you can name it, it loses some of its power. Right? It's sort of like naming a thing in a way is actually getting some control or power over it. If you say, like, oh, I know what they're doing. They're moving the goalposts. They're making false commitment. It almost normalizes it. It's like, oh, they're not horrible people because they're doing that. They're people who think they need to use a difficult tactic to get what they want. And in a way, it can then make it easier for us to stay centered in our response and maybe not move to a story about how horrible they are. They're not horrible people. They're using a difficult tactic. It's their behavior that's the challenge. It's not necessarily who they are as a human being. I am open to push back on that. That was a sweeping statement about people and those who use difficult tactics. Any reactions to that?
David.
Yeah, hi, Andrew.
Hi, it's Andrew. Thanks for this. Yeah, I'm good. Great to have you back with us on all of this. And I like how you're articulating all of this. I've got to step off soon, so I've got a quick question which sort of fits here, but I'll ask it. What do you do when the power is not in front of you? So you're talking about tactics used by, let's say, the person on the other side of the table, the minister.
Yep.
But as we know, ministers often may say no to our interests in policy reform because they're actually being lobbied by agrochemical companies or other concerns that we don't know about and never get to meet. So, yeah, I suppose my question would be, yes, the minister may be doing some of these tactics almost like their assistant, but it's because of other interests they have that we don't even know about, with people that are, offering that minister probably things that are more interesting than what we're offering. So how does that fit with being aware of and trying to address these types of tactics of the minister, let's say?
Yeah, I love the question. I think there are a few ways to think about it. The way and Elise, you may have a strong feeling about the response. Let me just get this one out of my head, and then I'll let you see if you have a different idea. The one that comes to mind for me very strongly, Andrew, is I see it as a challenge around interests. The last thing you said makes me think it could also be a problem around options, but mostly it's if that minister's got a primary interest of pleasing another stakeholder, or there are other people in the background who are offering options that meet the minister's interests better than the minister thinks we can, then it makes sense for the minister to ignore us or to delay. So the challenge becomes, if we were, for example, coaching a team who's in that situation, like, why is the minister doing this? We would be saying, let's make a short list of interests that we think the minister has. Can we imagine anyone else out there being able to meet those interests better than our group? And then we have to find a way to show the minister that a conversation with us increases the chance that their interests will be better met. Now, getting access to that moment, being able to get the minister to even hear that sentence coming from me can be a real challenge. And so before I get too carried away with that particular scenario and that hypothetical, I'll just say, I think broadly, the move would be to try to do some analysis on interests of that stakeholder who is not engaging us. And then secondly, we have the problem of access. How do we get the minister to at least give us 15 minutes to try to show the minister that we really do understand their interests? For example, one of their interests may be to have a strong relationship with someone that we have no control over. And we recognize that. And we recognize that the minister is not going to give us time unless the minister believes there's a chance that we'll be able to meet their interests better than in any other conversation they can have. I think for the moment, I would love to come back to that and try to get specific, like what do you do when, yeah, but you can't even tell the minister that. They're not even putting you on their calendar. How do you deal with that? And it can become about stakeholder management and actually getting the people who influence the minister to actually say to the minister, here's why I think you should talk to these people. I'm not naive about it. I understand that can be a mammoth challenge. That is the kind of thing that we spend time helping teams deal with. Elise, did your brain go in a different place?
So mine went to thinking about alternatives and thinking about how we grow our, like, who else are we talking to? If we, if we can't talk to the minister, where else are we going? But I think it might make sense Andrew, if you're okay with this, to push forward and then maybe even come back to this in a little bit later in the presentation if you can. But I'm not sure how long you can stay. So
no, that's great. I've got to pop off now because I've got to chair and intro another workshop, but I'll try to come back in half an hour or so.
We also, Andrew,
okay.
we also can make
Just
separate.
keep going, and I'll reconnect in, and we can always talk more afterwards. But it's
Exactly.
a really key issue for us and for the world. So
Yeah,
we can take more time on it later.
We also might separately offline in another conversation sort of come up with a playbook of here are the kinds of moves that people have made that we've all seen collectively, that people have made in an analogous situation, and see if we can categorize them so they're not infinite. Like, here are the paths we can take to try to get access to that minister who's not engaging with us. We were just naming a few that we think people tend to underuse. Mine was focused on interest, and Elise's idea was to focus on alternatives, and I think both of those are really helpful paths. Thanks for the question, Andrew. So let's move forward a notch. Elise, I'm wondering, is it helpful for this next part if I share my screen in order to annotate it? Can we switch?
Yeah, I think so. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to do that.
Are you able to just take over the share, or do you want me to actually stop sharing? Okay, you got it.
I've got it. Yeah, it gave me the power. I have the power to prevent you from sharing. And I'm wielding that power without any hesitation. Okay, so let me just advance. Sorry, my slide isn't where we just were. We'll also share our slides with you. If you'd like, after the program, we'll share it with our UNDP colleagues who can get it to you. There's some other information in here that you might find useful over time, but we chose not to spend as much time on that in this program. You can just look at this. You can see how burned this, how important this model is to us. Even in a question like Andrew's, the first place that Elise and I both went, our minds went to this diagram. Where's the problem dealing with that minister? I focused on interests, Elise focused on alternatives. But you can see how you can really hang a lot of your analysis in dealing with power on these elements. When it comes to dealing with difficult tactics, I'm going to combine this list of difficult tactics with the circle of value image. This is the combination that really inspired me to pursue conflict management as a career. It's combining these two. And in my experience, it takes multiple times mapping difficult tactics on this diagram before people really start using it in practice. So I suspect even if some of you have seen this with us before, it probably has not become an integrated part of your practice yet. And so I'm hoping that with a second touch, it will. For those of you who are being introduced to this, I want to make sure you really get it. So I'd like all of you, even if you've done a similar exercise with us in the past, help me diagnose where these difficult tactics, I've listed them on the left and the right of the slide, where they fall on the diagram. In other words, in which of the 7 elements is that person playing? I'll give you an example with one that I think is relatively easy. If we put it interrupting, it's the second one on the list on the left. If we said someone is interrupting us as a tactic for getting what they want, almost literally, which of these 7 elements are they manipulating? Where would you say the main problem is? if they're interrupting the conversation repeatedly. Elise, you might have to help me with the chat. I have to keep it down here.
That's fine. Nothing so far.
Okay. Yeah,
Oh,
I think I got it. I can see 3 at a time. Yeah, so you're all focusing on communication. For sure, some of you put a question mark. Don't hesitate. You got it. It's not that, this is not that, I'm not being that sophisticated in my analysis. It is as simple as that. So I'm just going to put a check on that one, saying, okay, so interrupting, we're saying the main problem is in communication. We had talked about lying. I just want to do that one for you before I start asking you to do the rest. Lying is a funny one because you can actually lie about any of these. You can lie about what your interests are. You can lie about what options you're willing to commit to. And now we're talking about commitment. You can lie about data. That's legitimacy. Information that you have that makes some options. You can lie about anything. But I actually think fundamentally it's helpful to think of lying as playing with the communication or maybe the relationship, where you're saying it's okay in our dynamic for there to be lies. You'll see why I think that's helpful in a little bit. Let me go to a different one and ask you to do the analysis. Let's say they're trying to bully us or intimidate us, maybe by using their position of authority, maybe because they're just sort of able to be scary in the way they interact. If they're bullying us, where would you say the problem is? You're welcome to use chat again, or you can take yourself off mute, that's fine. Yeah, Stephanie's quickly put in relationship. I would put it there too. In my mind, it's a relationship move. You could say intimidation, bullying, those are here. Yelling could be in a few places. Most people think of it as also being in relationship. Let me do a different one. I'm going to call it being positional. You'll see it on the, I can actually circle it for you. You can see over here, it says positional. Sometimes people just say stubborn. This is where a person just keeps saying like no to us, or even more easier to understand is they keep pushing us to say yes to their idea. Like if they say something like, this is non-negotiable, you must agree with this term, or you must say yes to our idea. Where are they trying to push us? If they're not willing to consider multiple options, it's just theirs, just their idea. They're trying to push us to agree or say yes to it. Where is that on this diagram? I don't think of it as options because when you're in options for our purposes, that's where they're willing to talk about multiple solutions. They're open to multiple ideas. And so you're right, it is an option. Their idea is one idea, but it becomes a position if it's now become a demand. A few of you are saying interests. Let me just be really clear. If they're in the interest box in the conversation, it means that they're sharing their interests or they're asking questions about interests. When someone just keeps repeating their demand, if they say, you have to say yes to my idea, they're making a different move. They're trying to push us to a place. Let me tell you a super quick example from the real world. If any of you have dealt with children, you'll know this example. I learned this one from my son when he was at a very young age. He says, I want a piece of cake. We say, no. I want a piece of cake. No. Give me a piece of cake. Fine. You can have half a piece of cake, but that's it. My son in that move just exhibited his power over me because he extracted a concession. Where did he get me to go? It's true, I came up with a different option, but I made a concession. I said yes. Where is that on our list? Yeah, Charles got it. It's commitment. I was fishing a little bit for the right answer there because I want to show your brains how to do this kind of diagnosis. You were being too sophisticated. I think by saying things like interest, yeah, you're right. Everything's about interest at the end of the day. Clearly, in that case, the interest that my son have is satisfying hunger, or getting something sweet, or maybe his interest was control, showing that he's the alpha in my family. not me, that he's in control. Those are all possible interests that are at play, but his move itself to make a demand, to be positional, basically saying, data, say yes to my idea, it's a commitment strategy. It's designed to actually make the other person concede and just say yes to move on. I'm just going to note that there is somebody in the waiting room if someone wants to just admit them quickly on the team. Okay, I just also want to be clear because a few people put alternatives. Just to be clear, alternatives are always away from the table. So that would be an idea that someone can do unilaterally. Just to be clear, I think some of you might be using alternatives and options as synonyms, and that's because in English, they do mean the same thing. In this model, options begin with O, they're on the table. It's what we can do together. It requires other stakeholders' consent. Alternatives are A, away from the table. You do that on your own unilaterally. If we can't find the minister, if we can't get access to the minister, what are we going to do? Who are we going to speak to? That's our alternative. It's something that we can do within our control. Okay, so let's actually, I forgot to put a mark on here. So that was commitment. That was being positional. Just to make sure you get it, if somebody does an ultimatum, if somebody says, either you say yes to my idea or I'm walking away. Saying yes to my idea is here. Where's walking away? Where are they going to go if they walk away?
Alternatives.
Yeah, it's alternatives again, right? We're right back to the same conversation. And if you use the Americanism, it's my way or the highway. The one that's more universal is take it, that's commit, or leave it, that's alternatives. We could keep going, but I think you probably see the pattern. The pattern is that you can train your mind to quite quickly see every difficult tactic people use as falling in these four corners. And in fact, we actually include these sort of red lines in the diagram to highlight that. Difficult tactics live outside the circle. One reason why this is such a powerful concept is because when you're confronted with other people's difficult tactics, what's our job? What's your advice? If somebody's using difficult tactics outside the circle, what do you want to do in the conversation? Some of you are looking at me like it's obvious, but yes, Charles actually was the first to write it.
I think Marguerite, you mouthed it as well, didn't you?
Yeah. Yeah, it's get into the circle. And so those of you who worked with us in the past know that we think this is an incredibly powerful mindset, but it also directly gives you advice on the behavior. So when you're confronted with someone's difficult tactic, you want to move the conversation to interests. What's driving this? What's underneath it? To options. Can we think of more ways to meet the interest, or to legitimacy? Can we actually understand what are people looking at that makes them think that that option is better than this option? That's sort of the key that we keep coming back to in helping people deal with power. There are many ways to help people deal with it, but this is the one that we come back to the most often. So we wanted to make sure it was really clear to you about how we connect that to the kinds of behaviors people who think they have power will often use.